Okay, well, I've got 12:02, so for the sake of time, I think we're going to get started this morning. Welcome to Wacky Wednesday. Today we have with us Miss Taylor Reeder. Taylor is a horticulture extension agent in Williamson County, and she is a wealth of information, and we're very blessed to have her with us at UP and TSU.
Thank you, Carla. And I don't know how you usually format, if you want to take questions at the end or throughout. Either is fine with me.
Okay, yes, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat box. Or if there's a little place where you can raise your hand if you need to unmute and ask the question. But it'd probably be best if you put them in the chat box and wait till the end so that we're not constantly interrupting Taylor.
All right, thank you, Carla.
All right.
Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Like Carla said, I'm Taylor Reeder here in Williamson County, and in past lives, I've worked with Alabama Extension and Florida Extension. So some of this information, I was telling Carla, my slideshow is a little bit wacky today because last night I went through and tried to update all my pictures and information, and I obviously forgot to save. So there's some older pictures on here. There may be some varieties of vegetables and things that you haven't heard of because they're not as common up here, but they would still grow up here. So no worries about that. But you may see some Florida varieties of some things uh, as we go through this. So I apologize in advance for my wacky presentation, but I guess it goes with the theme. So we're all good on that. But I'm going to try to go through and touch the high points of container gardening and raised beds. Those are both, you know, big subjects that we could delve in really deeply on each of those. But really the focus today, I'd like to focus more on, why we would choose a container garden or a raised bed over, say, planting in the ground, and what are the benefits of using both of those types of gardening. All right. So we'll start with container gardening first. Why do we container garden? Well, it's very versatile. It's very creative. So if you do have that creative vibe to you, if you're a very creative person, this is a way that you can experiment and you can play around with different textures and colors and themes in a smaller space. So that goes on to limited space. So let's say you're like me, and I was living in a townhome up to recently, and we had a 10 by 10 concrete patio, and that's all we had. We had no actual soil to plant in. So we did all container gardening. We didn't even have a big enough spot for a raised bed. So I have a blackberry plant in a pot. We had herbs, we had all kinds of things. So with our limited space, container gardening was perfect for us. We couldn't grow quite as much, but were able to utilize that space to grow some things that we wanted to have, like herbs for cooking. Maybe you have limited mobility. So with containers and raised beds, we are gardening up and out of our soil. So we aren't low to the ground. We can put these up higher where they're easily accessible. Maybe you've got an unsuitable site. So maybe you've got a big slope. Maybe you've got an area that's just not good to grow in, too much shade, something like that in your yard. So using containers, you can put those in areas and move them around to a site that is more suitable, and you can create your own gardening environment. Um, Confines and vases. And really, when I say this, we shouldn't be planting in vases at all. I need to change it to aggressives, because our native plants, we do have some that are not what we would classify as invasive, but what we would like to call aggressive. So maybe your mints, something like that, that is just wants to spread and take over your whole garden. You can contain it into a pot or a raised bed so that it doesn't spread where you don't want it to. Some of the disadvantages, there are some with container gardening, and really in the long run, I don't know that it's necessarily a big disadvantage, but with watering and fertilizer, I was actually talking with someone today about they grew tomatoes in containers, And they asked about watering frequency. And one of the disadvantages of having, say, a container tomato is the soil to root ratio is smaller. So you've got more roots to soil than you would say in your native soil or in a raised bed. So as that plant grows, the pot fills up with roots and there's less soil to retain that moisture and keep it there next to the roots for the plant to take up. So you do end up having to water more often. And you may have noticed that as, say, your tomatoes got bigger in your containers, you started noticing them wilting faster as the season went on and as they grew bigger. And it's just because there's more roots in there and they're displacing and taking the space around that soil. And so there's just more to keep up with. And so you just sometimes have to water more often. They also drain better than our native soils, which is a benefit. But then again, we're in need to be checking on them, making sure that we're watering them on a consistent basis. And then with our native soils, they do come with some of their own nutrients. And so a lot of times we have to amend with nutrients in our container gardens. Choosing a container, you can be as creative as you want to be. Like I said, with containers, you can have fun with it. I mean, I'm sure, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm from the country in Alabama, but I've seen many a toilet in a yard growing plants. And you can, as long as it holds soil and will drain, you can grow plants in it. So you can be as fun and funky and wacky as you'd like to be. Clay pots, hanging baskets, maybe just a bag of potting soil. Maybe you just want to go low key. You just get a bag of potting soil, put a few holes in it, throw some plants in there. You're good to go. When choosing containers, always check for a drainage hole. That was actually, again, I was talking with someone yesterday about succulents, and she had just bought herself some succulents, and they aren't the most water heavy needing plant, but she wasn't aware if they had a drainage hole at the bottom. And for a lot of our container plants, that's for all of them. We want to make sure we have a drainage hole. But when you go to, say, I love to go to TJ Maxx and I love to go to Home Goods and all that, a lot of their pots are more decorative than they are functional. And so they won't come with drainage holes. So that's something to always check for. I get calls, with people with house plants that are rotten and dead. And when they pull it out, it's just water sitting in the bottom. It didn't have drainage holes. So making sure that it has adequate drainage, needs to be big enough to hold the mature plant. So you may start out like a fern. You may start out with a 6-inch container, smaller container, and as it grows, it starts to, like I mentioned before, fill up with roots. And so you need to pot it up to a bigger size so that you can have more space for that root system to grow and have more soil to retain the moisture and nutrients that the plant needs. And then the type of pot can depend on location. On here I have avoid black containers in full sun, and really just with that, they get warmer, and so they can sometimes be too warm around the root system. I don't see it happen often, but it can happen. Remember, porous containers like terracotta are going to wick away moisture. So some people like to soak their terracotta containers and get them saturated before they plant. It also makes them more prone to cracking because they will get that moisture in them, and then say we have cold that comes through or something like that, they may crack. And then decide, do you want it to be attractive? Do you want it to go along with your theme? Is it just purely for function? So you can be as creative as you want. You can coordinate color with plant material, or you can paint it, have a fun activity with kids, grandkids, get some terracotta pots and paint them, have fun with it. One thing to consider is how heavy the container is, because chances are you may have to move it over time. And if it's a giant container that's already heavy on its own, once you add soil and a mature plant, it may be impossible to move. So thinking about having it on wheels, if you're planning on wheeling it in and out with this changing of the seasons, or something like styrofoam or fiberglass planters that look like maybe concrete, but they aren't as heavy as concrete. And then you could always throw in some materials in the bottom, if you don't need all that root space to kind of lighten it so you're not filling the whole thing up with soil. So after choosing containers, we want to choose our potting mixture or our soilless substrate. So these mixtures aren't actually soil. They're usually a combination of peat moss, which is the brown, squishy, soft stuff, perlite, vermiculite. Some of them contain fertilizers if you get them with the fertilizers already added. But these soilless mixtures tend to work best for growing potted or container plants. They keep the soil, it's moist, they keep it moist around the plant, but they also drain well. So that's the benefit of having these. And they're usually more lightweight than, say, our native soils. So instead of, digging up our native soils and putting them in our containers, these substrates are lighter weight, drain a little bit better, and a lot of times they're sanitized for disease, insects, weed seeds, things like that that you actually have in your native soil. So they won't be adding them to your potting mix. You can create your own, or you can buy it pre-bagged. If you're going to create your own, standard mixtures, usually, like I said, peat moss, something that helps with drainage, like a perlite or a vermiculite, maybe adding in some compost. Some people like to put sand in their mixtures. If you are going to put sand, make sure it's coarse sand, like construction grade sand, not your fine, like playground sand. That's not the kind that you want to put in any growing situation. And then you can always, let's say you've got a container or a raised bed or something that's had soil in it for a while, or you've made your own mix and you want to test it out for its nutrients. We do offer that testing. It is a little more expensive than your native soil testing. I think it's $35 to have that potting mix tested, but you can have it tested to determine nutrient needs. Selecting plants. So with containers, you can go just about any direction you want. You can even do woody plants. Always got to think about mature size for the space that it's growing in. That's the biggest key. So annual bedding plants, of course, herbaceous perennials, bulbs, herbs, water garden plants. Maybe you want to start your own bog garden. You can do all of this in containers, just making sure that you choose the right pot for the right plant. Most vegetables are grown in particular seasons, so that makes them good container plants. You can change things out, change it up with the season, have something different growing at different times of year. You want to select your more compact varieties, like with tomatoes. We have what we call indeterminate and determinate varieties. And so our indeterminate varieties, or our vining type, will grow bigger and bigger and continue to produce throughout the season. And so, like our cherry tomatoes, they tend to get big and tall and top heavy. So they will grow in a container for sure, but they may get too big for the pot that you're growing them in. Our determinate tomatoes are ones that produce most of their fruit at one time. And they are what we call our bush type tomatoes. So they stay a little more compact. Must plant a proper size and keep watered. So with this, we're talking about, at least maybe a 5-gallon size bucket, like the Lowe's Home Depot bucket that you see, that kind of size for tomatoes. Anything that's got a larger fruiting capacity, tomato, squash, etc. Around that size, or a little bit smaller for peppers, cucumbers, maybe some beans and peas. And then you can go smaller for our smaller crops like lettuce and radishes. I love to grow leaf type, not head type lettuce, but leaf type lettuce in containers. It's a really easy one, fun one. It makes me feel successful because they usually almost always come up. So it makes me happy. Radishes are kind of the same way. They're pretty, I always tell people, if you get discouraged with vegetable gardening, because everybody wants to start with tomatoes, and tomatoes are not our easiest crop to grow. They have a lot of issues that come along with them and a lot of maintenance. Grow radishes. They're fun. They're usually pretty quick turnover, and they are usually pretty successful. And there's so many different cool varieties, colors. It's just a lot of fun. So some different types Tomatoes for, let's say, hanging baskets. There's a few Florida varieties, Florida Gold, Florida Basket. These are ones that will kind of drape and grow well in hanging baskets. Of course, your tiny, you've got some of your cherry tomatoes, Husky Gold, Tumbling Tom. All those are ones that would do well in containers. A few squash varieties that tend to be on the smaller side, but when we say generally, no squash plant is going to be small. You're going to need space for it. That's why you need a larger container for it. It's all your squashes, your zucchinis are going to want to creep and they're going to get big. And so you just got to realize that when you're putting them in, say, a container type situation. And really, even in raised beds, a lot of times I tell people to, if they're going to plant squash, zucchini, something like that, then they're going to have to give it room and they may not be able to put as much in those beds. Here's just a few varieties, and really we have some really good publications. I've got the references later on, but we've got some great publications on vegetable gardening and varieties and on raised bed gardening as well. So that's a place you can go and check and kind of make your list. So mixed containers, vegetables can be interplanted with herbs, annuals, vines. I mean, this bottom right picture, you've got chard, you've got grasses. It's hard to tell what else is back there. I can't remember. But you can mix up your containers. Throw some herbs and flowers and veggies into a container. And, as long as they have generally the same light and water requirements, they'll do well together. And then you can mix it up by having different textures, heights. We always like to call it the thriller, filler, and spiller when we talk about container gardening. So we want our thriller, which is our tall, something that's stately, that attracts attention. Our filler, which kind of fills in around the middle region. And then our spiller, which kind of pours out of the container. So you've got all the bases covered. It makes a nice, cohesive design. Foliage plants are a great option if you've never considered them. I love putting coleus in my containers because it's a very hardy plant. They come in so many different colors and varieties. In a picture later on, you'll see one of my favorite coleus varieties is called wasabi. And it's like a chartreuse green, light green with kind of a ruffled edge, and it's just really pretty, produces well. And you grow these not for the flower, you grow these for the foliage. In my cutting gardens, I love to put a red-leaved or purple-leafed basil. They smell good for your arrangements, and they also have a really pretty foliage color, so they make a good option as well. So you've got lots of different options when it comes to foliage plants like Dusty Miller, maybe even some of our vegetables like lettuces, or our ornamental cabbages and kales. I'm sure you've seen those. They make nice ornamental plants for your containers. Of course, trailing vining, so you can have them drape over the edge of the pot. One of my favorites, I love Creeping Jenny. It's another one that's kind of chartreuse. I kind of like to mix leaf colors, some light green with some purple, or maybe some dark green and some light green mixed together. But, you've got your wave petunias. You've got a lot of options that will creep and droop over. Maybe even some of your sedums. I love sedums, which are a succulent. We have a lot of great varieties of sedums that do well, and some will kind of creep and drape. Blooming plants, of course, that's usually what I kind of use for my filler are the blooms. And we've got so many different varieties. I mean, this is just a few. We've got a couple of great publications with UT on annuals and perennials, and you can go through that list. And one of the things I want to mention here is you also have options for shade. So don't think just because you don't have sun, you can't grow something. The coleus that I mentioned earlier, most of those varieties are shade tolerant. We have several flowers that will tolerate shade, ferns, things like that. So don't think just because you don't have sunlight, you can't do a nice, pretty container. There are options. Our upright plants, which is our thriller, we've got grasses, we've got flowers with long, tall spikes like Beatrice and some other flowers. that will give you that upright look. I like the elephant ear type, and the caladiums kind of give a little bit of height, but they've got a really distinct, fun foliage. Just something tall that attracts attention. Tropicals, we'd have to think of them as annuals, but you could grow them in a container, and you may want to bring them in the winter, or you may just have to. A lot of our container plants, sometimes we will just kind of recycle out some of them and replace them each year. So we've already kind of talked about this. The thriller, the filler, the spiller is a good place to start when you're designing a container. So thinking of how it's going to look at all different levels. You can also go with, we're not going to go all through this, but you can also do color themes. One of my favorite things to do is a monochromatic color scheme in container gardens. And so I like purple's my favorite flower color. And so I'll do different shades of purple mixed in with, greens or whites that are kind of act as a neutral. And so having those different shades of purple gives interest, but it's not, a bunch of different things going on at once. It's not too chaotic. And so I like to do those kind of monochromatic themes with mine. Maybe you want to do complementary colors, purple and yellow. They go really well together. They're complementary colors. Maybe orange and blue, those are complementary colors as well. So adding a color theme can give when we talk about landscape design and design aspects, what we always talk about is unification and unifying the landscape, or in this point, the containers. And so having a theme to it, if maybe you've got several different pots, having a general theme, maybe it's color, maybe it's texture, maybe you're using the one plant, like petunias in all of those pots, that unifies it and makes it feel more cohesive and like you actually planned it. Of course, here's the color wheel. You've probably all seen it. So analogous colors are ones sitting beside each other, complementary are ones across from each other. So thinking of those themes is always a lot of fun, I think. Design tips: make use of your foliage plants, whether it's leaf shape or texture or size. That can add some contrast and interest to your containers. Vary the shape of flowers. Use different, I love diamond frost. It adds a light kind of airy texture. If you haven't seen it, it's got tiny little white flowers and tiny little green leaves, and it just kind of makes it look it looks airy. Use odd numbers. And this is, sometimes when you're packing a container full, you can't really tell the odd numbers, but it's a general kind of thought that odd numbers feel more natural than even numbers. And when we have an odd number, it kind of stops our eye. Instead of when we say we have two of something, our eye automatically wants to go right in between the two. So adding a third or adding an odd number to it kind of makes it in our minds feel more natural and kind of stops our eye where we're looking. Another theme idea you could go with are things like maybe you want to do a salsa garden. So you have all the plants that go into making salsa in different containers, and that can be your theme. So having things like red onions and tomatoes and peppers, cilantro. But just think some of these, like I have a really hard time getting cilantro to grow well. And if y'all are on here and you've had experience the same, my thoughts are I think it's more of a cool season herb, and that's why it doesn't do as well when I'm growing my tomatoes. I could be incorrect on that, but I think it is more cool season, and it always wants to bolt or flower or yellow and die on me when I'm trying to grow it in the middle of the summer. Maybe it's just I don't have a green thumb for cilantro. Maybe a pizza garden. So maybe you make pizzas with your family. So all the ingredients you love, like oregano and rosemary, parsley, basil, tomatoes, adding those things and making a theme out of it for your container gardens. Of course, herbs are great for containers. Herbs are another one of those things when people get distraught, they get defeated about trying to vegetable garden or garden in general. I love to tell them to try to grow some herbs because for the most part, our herbs do really well, especially in a container environment where the soil is moist and well drained. One of my favorites to grow is parsley. I remember when we got those 5 inches of snow uh, earlier this year here in Williamson County. The only thing that stayed green the whole time was my parsley. It was still alive and thriving throughout the entire winter. So it made me feel successful. But I also love growing chives and that's that purple you see. Chives are kind of like an edible ornamental in a way because they have this really pretty purple flower that stays on for a long time. And so it adds interest and color, whereas everything else might just be green, but it adds a little pop of color and a little interest to your containers or your landscape. So here's just some, there's tons of different herbs you can grow, and it all just depends on what you like. And going through this quickly, it's just talking about, larger containers, and really even 24-inch for some of these they may need even more space than this. So it's kind of a lot of gardening is just trial and error and learning what works best for you. And some of these, like tomatoes and cucumbers, you can trellis and cage and make them sturdier and grow vertically, in those small spaces, grow vertically instead of horizontally. And smaller containers are smaller plants, of course, things like our spinaches, our non-heading lettuce, like I mentioned, our leaf-type lettuces, herbs. Strawberries. I'm sure you've all seen strawberry pots. Strawberries are a great one to try and grow in containers. It's a fun one for the family. I mean, you never know how much you're going to produce. You could produce enough to make your own, I don't know, whatever you like, strawberry shortcake or cobbler. As far as planting goes, always start with healthy, pest-free plants. Kind of come up with a plan before you start planting. That's what I always do. I always just place the pots in the container and kind of get a visual idea of it and then plant. You can cover the drainage hole with some like fabric, landscape fabric, or maybe a couple pieces of broken pottery. That'll just help with the drainage, help keep the soil from washing out. You don't want to fill the container all the way to the top when you're planting. You don't want to leave a little room. Make sure your potting mix is wet, moist. Sorry if you don't like the word moist. I've said it a lot, but make sure it's wet and allow it to kind of settle before you plant. Especially if you're using older potting mix. The thing with like peat moss, it can go hydrophobic really easily. So basically it repels water instead of takes in water. And so if we let it get too dry, we have to wet it back in. And so it's a lot of, or if you buy, let's say, a bale of peat moss, that's something you have to do is add water, mix, and add water, mix until it starts retaining that moisture instead of repelling it. And you may have seen this in some of your containers where you poured water on the top, it just sat there and just pooled on top and it didn't drain into the pot for a long time. And it may be that you let your potting mix get too dry and it's repelling that water instead of taking it in. And then, of course, remove your plants from the containers before planting. That's usually ideal. And I always like to go in, I don't know if I talk about it here, but I always like to just take off the bottom, third of the plant, rough up the bottom, rough up the roots, because a lot of those plants we buy at the landscape center, the big box store, whatever, they've been sitting and growing in those containers for a while. And so roughing up the roots at the bottom, or maybe just kind of ripping off the bottom third of it, isn't going to hurt it. It'll grow more roots and it'll keep it from being root bound or pot bound where it just keeps growing in a circle, like it's still in that pot. It's kind of roughing up the edges and sides. As long as you don't, take majority of the roots off of the plant, they will be fine and they'll thank you for it. Fertilizing, if your soilless media doesn't contain fertilizer, sometimes you may want to add fertilizer. Follow the directions, choose one that you think may, they make all different kinds, some for flowers, some for vegetables, some for, acid-loving plants. So going along with what you think you might need and fertilizing according to the label. Watering is definitely critical to any type of planting and growing that we do. You may have to water, every other day, or in the hot summer, you may have to water every day, depending on the size of your container and how much plant material you have in there. Like I mentioned, the more root system that's in the bottom, the more watering you're going to have to do because it just can't keep up and have that moisture that it needs. You can do drip irrigation and timers for your pots. This is something that my mom asked for Mother's Day that we helped install. We bought several little drip kits from, Lowe's, Home Depot, somewhere like that. And they were little mist heads, little emitters. And what we did is we just attached it to their spigot on the side of the house, and it had a timer, just a basic, $30 timer. And so she could set it because she has countless number of containers, and she hated, especially in the summer, having to go out and water. It would take her hours to water in the morning. So this way she can set it to water and put the little emitters in each container, and she kind of doesn't have to worry about it. Now, every once in a while, it's good to go and check, make sure they haven't moved or been knocked out, things like that. But if you're going on vacation for a while, that's a good option. Or if you've got, a really good friend that may come water your plants, that is also a good option. Tips for success. In the winter, of course, we're going to need a little more protection. That may be bringing them inside, pushing them together. So it kind of creates, they're sitting with each other. They're kind of huddled together, creates some warmth in between them, protects them from the wind, things like that. Moving them to a protected area, like up against the house or, up against a tree, things like that to protect them from the cold weather we have. Vining plants may require staking or trellising so they don't tip over on you. If you're going to reuse your pots, it's a good idea to clean them in between use. Something like a 10% bleach solution will work well. This can, help with any pests you might have had or any disease that might be in the soil that had transferred to the pot. And soak your porous containers before planting. Like I said, that'll keep them saturated and keep them from wicking the moisture away. Adding things in the bottom, lightweight items, bottom of pots that you don't need all of the soil for can help with weight. And then hardening off your plants. So if, let's say you grew your own from seed, gradually introducing them to the sun impact, the weather, wind, etc. Gradually introducing them to that instead of just taking them from the nice cushy inside and then throwing them in a pot in the full sun will help them establish better. And then you can place your containers on top of, say, bricks, coasters, things like that to help them drain a little bit better. So that's container garden. I'm going to see how much time I'm going to, share. If anybody has any questions real quick, or, oh, I got to work. So we'll just watch this and put your questions in the chat box if you have them. let me go back to my presentation. So that was a container I did last year, and one of my, like I said, I love purple. Purple and orange together is one of my favorite combinations. And so with that container, it was obviously very full. And so that's something you can do with containers. Yeah, you can make it as packed in there as you want, but just know, like with mine, later on, it's going to get really full and overflowing. And so you may have to remove a few plants, cut some things back. With mine, that, of course, the coleus just kind of went crazy on me, so I was always pruning it back. But like I mentioned in the video, you can use those for propagation. So coleus is really easy to propagate. I mean, literally, you can just snap off the top, stick it in a jar of water, and it'll root. So that's a fun thing you can do as well, is propagate some of your plants. So making sure that you're, make sure it's pot bound, you're roughing up the roots. Make sure that when you plant, kind of like you saw, I was kind of placing them to make sure it all kind of fit the way I wanted it to, and then I planted it. And water, water it all in once you're done. So that's containers, and we're gonna go into raised bed garden now. And it's a very similar strategy. It's just a kind of a larger container in a sense, and it gives you more room, literally and figuratively, to grow and expand and try different things. Most often our raised beds have been used for vegetable gardening, especially for those that don't have good soil to grow in, or maybe have a handicap, a physical limitation. You can raise these up out of the soil to a height of whatever height's comfortable for you, and have that where it's easier to pick and maintain. Also, you get to make your own soil, so you don't have to deal with any complications you might have with your natural soil. So raised bed gardening, like I mentioned, is gardening with in which the soil is formed in I say generally 3 to 4 foot wide bed. And you can make them wider, but the good thing about keeping them to about 4 feet wide is that you can easily reach. I've got short arms, so especially for those short arm folks like myself, reach in to the middle easily from either side and not have to actually climb up into it to get something. But you can make it any shape, length, however you want. The soil is raised above the ground. Usually, I like to say at least a foot. I like to leave it at least a foot of soil, but you could go down to 6 inches and grow some of your more shallow rooted crops. But I like to go, at least a foot deep. That gives adequate room for all of our roots, for most of our vegetables and other plants to grow. However, the framing of the bed is whatever you'd like to make it. Wood, rock, concrete blocks. Outside of our office, we had a few raised beds made out of plywood, and they started to look a little sad. So this year we endeavored to redo them. But as you well know, the price of wood is astronomical right now. And so every situation we came up against, the wood was just really expensive. And we actually found some split face blocks they used to build our building, extra pallets of them up on our facility. And we made our entire bed, and I wish I could have my phone so I could take you out there to see it. Should have taken a picture of it. But we made our raised beds out of those blocks. We didn't actually have to purchase any wood material at all. Right now, we just need to get some soil, which is also not necessarily the cheapest part, and I'll talk about that. Now we just got to fill up the rest of it with soil, but we made it out of those split face blocks. So as long as it'll contain that soil, usually you can use almost any material you want to frame it. Raised bed gardens can help maximize your available space. Typically, they're smaller than your traditional garden area. It makes them a good option for limited space. We've got a small area. When I was in Alabama, we had at our office 53 raised beds that we used as kind of a community garden. And it was for those, for veterans and those who didn't have a lot of space at home. They would have this option for growing their vegetables each year. And they're a good alternative to poor soil. Let's say, our soil gets a bad rap. Our clay soil, we have heavy clay soil here where I am and in most parts of the state, gets a bad rap. It is good for growing a lot of things. But there are some, and it's good for growing a vegetable garden, but there are some downsides to it. And one of those things is it can compact really easily. And a lot of our houses and homes are on these new developments where a lot of construction traffic has come, or maybe it's old farmland and you have some heavily compacted soils. They don't drain very well. So instead of maybe trying to amend and maybe do like no-till situation, things like that, you could do a raised bed and kind of start with your own new soil. So maybe it's a poor soil, maybe it's rocky, maybe it's a sloped area like in the picture to the right, and you can adapt your bed to fit that sloped area. Usually our raised beds are filled with high quality soil mixes that have large amounts of organic matter, and again, this helps improve drainage, increase yields. And with organic matter, peat, peat moss is technically organic matter. As far as sustainability, anyways, that's a different subject. But organic matter is decomposing plant animal material, things like compost. Maybe you've bought some manure, things like that. Those are organic matters. And that's a lot of what we use in our beds. Now, I have seen people backfill with some topsoil, native soils at the bottom. And just kind of things to think about is, again, our native soils may not be the best draining, so you may encounter some drainage issues. Or in 2016, we had a really bad drought, and we had some in 2019 too, but I just remember in Alabama, we have clay there too, and it was like a brick when it got really dry, and it cracked along the top, and it was so hard to dig into. Also, the organic matter is a lot easier to weed. Raised beds are, in my opinion, a lot easier to pull a weed out of. So it makes weeding just a little bit easier. Soil above ground level tends to drain better. It warms up a little bit quicker, so you may be able to get some early planting in. The thing about it being raised above ground level is, though, it is more sensitive, like a container, to cold snaps, because our native soil, it tends to stay a little bit warmer or warm itself a little bit better. And so I've seen a lot of people turn their raised beds into cold frames where they put windows on the top, things like that, kind of make a cold frame which traps that heat and keeps things warm so they can start earlier. Or maybe putting kind of fabric, frost cloth over the top, a kind of a mini little dome over it to retain that heat and keep plants longer or start them earlier. Excuse me. Raised beds can help eliminate physical limitations, like we mentioned before, better access. I like mine to be at least 18 inches tall, which gives it a nice height for not having to bend over as far. Sometimes we can get higher yields out of our raised beds than we could in our native soils, and it could be to do with the good drainage of the soils. It could be to do with when we're in a raised bed situation, we're packing them in a little bit tighter because we don't have as much space. But you can sometimes see higher yields. Maybe it's because since it's a little bit smaller, a little easier access, you're more willing to put in a little more labor into them. Square foot gardening is, and I think I'll talk about that in a second. You're not, let's say, as weather restricted with your raised beds, the soil getting muddy and things like that. You don't really need heavy equipment. And really, I mean, if you practice no-till, you're not using heavy equipment in your in-ground beds either. But I do know some people that like to till, and with a raised bed garden, when you're making your own soil, that's not always a necessary thing to do. Aesthetic value. This is something, you can make it match your hardscapes around your home. I know I have a master gardener who, that's what she did. She had cedar posts at her house, so she made her raised beds out of cedar, and it matched the aesthetic of her home. So that's something you can do with it. You can use it as a way to highlight an area of your landscape, make a little room, like the picture to the left, kind of make a little contained area, a little more intimate area using those raised beds. So there's a lot of things aesthetic wise you can do with raised beds. Construct and raised, raised could just be, like I said, just 6 to 12 inches off the ground. It doesn't have to be super tall. Uh, Here you've got an example of square foot gardening, and if you're not familiar, that's a whole nother subject, but there's books on it, and it's basically breaking down your garden into square foot plots and growing specific things in each of that square foot. So let's say one tomato plant per square foot and one pepper plant, but maybe we'll have, 2 basil or 4 basil. And the smaller the plants, the more we can fit in a square foot. And it's a fun way to garden, especially with kids, grandkids, to kind of teach them, math as well as gardening and kind of the science aspect as well. So it's kind of like almost a STEM type education, but it's just a different way of looking at gardening and increasing your yield per space and utilizing each square foot of your garden. In the last picture, you saw different types of trellises. You can make trellises out of PVC. You can make it out of hog wire. You can trellis your cucumbers, any of your vining plants, and have easier access where you're not bending over and they're not creeping along the ground. They're growing up. You probably have seen the pantyhose holding the watermelon as it's being trellised. So there are lots of crops that you can go vertically with. These are just some examples of square foot gardening and, size of plant for the space and how many you could realistically in general fit in a square foot. Here's a fun one where they've got almost like a little watchtower over their garden, but they've just gone kind of stair-stepped their beds up. Like I said, older pictures on some of these. Maybe you need to cage in your raised bed, so maybe wildlife is an issue, and using a raised bed, putting a fence around it can be easy to do and helpful to keep the critters out of your garden. Here's another example of square foot gardening with raised bed. And let's see another picture. There's the pantyhose. You can see the pantyhose holding the melons. Now just know that just like with any normal garden, in-ground gardening, with raised beds you can get things too full. We got okra in here, we got, trellising, we've got, it's a lot going on. So making sure you manage your expectations, maybe start small, work your way up, so you're not having a lot to maintain and having a lot of things kind of growing on top of each other. Just some more pictures. And then with the soil and of raised beds, it's very similar, like I said, to the soil of a container garden. There's a lot more of it in a raised bed, and soil can be expensive. It's one of the more expensive parts of building a raised bed. So you have options as far as, filling part of it. If you want to go really tall with it, filling part of it with something besides bagged potting mix, like compost. I know here in Williamson County, our local landfill has a compost. You can pay $20 for, and they'll fill up a truck bed full of compost, and you can use it however. So you may have something like that near you to help fill in with some of that soil, so it's not so expensive. I had a master gardener in Alabama who put a whole log in the bottom of his to fill it up, and eventually it broke down. You just got to be careful with things like sawdust and wood chips. If they're not already starting to decompose, a lot of times they'll wick away moisture and nutrients to kind of break themselves down. And so the same thing kind of goes with compost that hasn't really been composted for a long time. You want to make sure that it's on its way to decomposing and it's been well composted before you put it into your beds, so it's not taking away from what you're planting. Another thing, and there's not as much cotton production here, but we use a lot of gin trash, which was the leftovers after cotton has been processed. And so it was old stems, leaves, things like that, seeds. And the thing is, you didn't want fresh gin trash because it would wick away all the moisture and nutrients to break itself down. Also, you want something that's had been composted for a few years. You don't want to put, there's a lot of manures that you wouldn't want to put fresh onto any growing situation. You want to make sure they're well broken. They're starting to compost. They've been composted. But adding that organic matter and filling it with different things. I had someone who, they wanted to recycle and reuse plastic bottles. So they just threw a bunch of plastic bottles into the bottom, and then put soil on top of that, plastic water bottles to kind of fill up the space. And it seemed to work for them. But having those materials kind of offset their cost for buying a lot of soil. But with the soil as substrates, again, we may have to lime, we may have to fertilize, and sometimes it's good to go through a growing season and kind of see what your soil needs and not over apply fertilizer and over apply lime if you don't need it. I see that happen a lot. People will grow, say, tomatoes, and they'll get these big, beautiful, green, bushy tomatoes, but no fruit. And a lot of times it's because they've overapplied nitrogen. And so nitrogen goes towards leaf production. And so they get beautiful leaves, but it's taking away from the fruit production. And so you get this big, beautiful green tomato plant and not a lot of fruit. So sometimes it just takes going through a few seasons of growing to really know what you need and what you want to get out of your container or raised bed garden. Some publications that are available, Tennessee Home Fruit and Vegetable Garden Calendar. They've got it for fruit now this year as well as vegetables. And so that's a good one to kind of follow along with what you should be doing throughout the season for fruits and vegetables. There's a good vegetable garden planning and planting publication as well. And then building and using raised beds. There's one specific to raised beds if you have more questions. And like I mentioned before, I don't have them on here, but there's a couple great publications on annuals and perennials as well for, say, your container gardens. So that's all I have. Hopefully I didn't go through it too fast and you were able to understand what I was saying. In my family, if you didn't talk fast and you didn't talk loud, you didn't get to talk at all. So hopefully you were able to keep up with what I was saying and understand what I was going through and got something out of this. But what questions do y'all have?
Okay, thank you, Taylor.
Yeah.
I see one question in the chat box. When talking about container size, 5 gallon, is that depth? What about width?
So 5 gallon was more just the actual holding size. So it wasn't as far as, 5 gallons. I don't know, I guess you could do 5 gallons deep, but 5 gallons is just more how much soil it's going to hold.
Yeah, like a 5 gallon bucket.
5 gallons of soil. So a lot of our container plants are grown by the gallon and not the size. So they're like a 1 gallon, a 3 gallon, a 15 gallon. So 5 gallons is how much soil it'll hold. And something fun to do with kids is the drainage test with a sponge. Carly, you've probably done that before, where you soak a sponge and you turn it lengthwise like this and it drains just a little, but when you turn it like this, sorry, I'm trying to see if you can see, but when you turn it upright like this, it drains a lot faster, and that's the gravity. So when you have a more upright, taller, narrower container, it might actually drain faster than a shallower, wider container.
Okay, that makes sense.
So something about.
Okay. All right. We've got one from Iris. Says, my balcony is facing west, so they can't access 8 hours of full sun, more like 5 hours tops. Any vegetables or fruits that can thrive in that situation?
Most of our vegetables to thrive, to do really well, are going to need at least, 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. I would say for that situation, you could grow some of our lettuces. You could grow some of our ones that don't need a lot of that sunlight. Some of your little carrots and things like that are going to do maybe a little better. But I like the lettuces, the herbs. You could probably grow some herbs there and do really well. Let's see, fruit wise, I mean, you're kind of limited on fruits and containers in general. Most of our container fruits are things like strawberries. If you've got a big container, you could grow a blueberry plant, but if you've got a patio, that might be not as feasible of an option. What do you think, Carla? What have you experienced?
Well, yeah, we've kind of talked about the same type of options is, raising them up maybe to where they're up above the balcony to where the sun can get to them. There are also containers, the long containers that actually sit on your balcony rail.
And hang over.
Now, that may get them up to where there is more sunlight, and that makes it easier to garden also. But yeah, I agree with what you said. It's just not a good situation with the sunlight.
It's just tough. I mean, when you have not enough sunlight, they get kind of leggy. They don't produce as well. Any of your flowering plants aren't going to flower as much. So some of your leafy type ones may do slightly marginally better in that situation.
Or maybe the upside down tomato planters where they're hanging and they're higher and they get more sunlight, because when they sit at the base of the patio,
they have to wait for
the rails around it just kind of close it all off and make it more shaded. So
yeah.
And trellising, somebody typed in there trellising with the vining fruits. Okay, well, we probably better wrap up since we've got another meeting to be on.
Yeah, I'm sorry, y'all. I've talked so long.
We booked ourselves back to back today.
But if you come up with questions after this, you're more than welcome to get in touch with me or any of us on here. I'm sure could help you out.
Okay, when I follow up, I will send everybody a copy of this recording, and I usually convert it to a YouTube video and post it, but I will email out your email address.
Wonderful.
Send out your email address. Yeah.
That'd be great.
All right. All right. Thank you very much. And thanks for everybody joining us today.